All right, here we go on a lovely Monday afternoon in the Rockies, where we've enjoyed a fairly weekend, a little bit on the hot side. We can get to the weather kind of things a little bit later this evening at 5 o'clock Mountain, at least for now. That's when it'll be, and talk about the incredible heat that's kind of set itself up across much of the United States, and from what I can see is going to be around for a little while. So right now we're playing with the currency of summer, and summer is here for a bit. When I got into, basically my teens, I had a question ahead of me. Where do I go as a professional? Where do I go as a career? And I was really drawn to meteorology. I was drawn to earth sciences. That was my big boy, was earth sciences. But then there was this backside of me that really liked economics. And even as a young teenager, I was probably 13, 14 at the time, at most, subscribing to U.S. News and World Report because I was interested in economics. And they would, get out the weekly magazine and the indicators and all sorts of stuff. And Reagan was in the beginnings of his first terms. And so I was kind of diving into economics at the same time exploring astronomy and weather and meteorology and climate, of course, that goes along with both of those. And so when I got to college, I was still this debate. I was undeclared as a major. Where do I go? Do I go into economics and meteorology? And ultimately, it ended up in the earth sciences side of things, and I'm kind of grateful for that. But that interest still doesn't disappear in some of these other things that we carry through in life. Yes, Karen, I hope the audio is good enough right now because we're going to keep rolling. I did play with the background a bit, got rid of the chroma key to see if we can get a little bit of a better image for the moment. So we'll see how that plays out. But so what I ended up in was meteorology, but then always with this interest in investing and in numbers. And we're going to start our little show on. Oh God, yes, Karen, I was absolutely a nerd. So I want to roll into currencies, and I'm going to call this kind of back to the future, because what has worked in the past and worked very well to enable a stable currency, to a stable economic expansion, despite a doubling of the population or even a quadrupling of the population. We had very little inflation during the 19th century, from the beginning of the 1800s all the way through about the time the Federal Reserve was formed. So what was working back then that is failing us now? And this is why I want to call this kind of back to the future. So the whole point of this was I like numbers. And so I'm going to roll back to Christmas 1976, and I'm just a 10-year-old kid and utterly thrilled to, from my parents, get this Texas Instruments calculator for Christmas. Look at that smile on my face. My goodness. And so my fascination for the power of numbers would compound each year in my life. I was always playing on that calculator. And now we have, calculators as a secondary, if that, function in these incredible devices we have as phones. And this phone obviously would have been almost worthless at that point in time without the internet, which still was in the very, very infantile stages at that point. So I was always kind of destined to be with numbers, and there I was with my watch in hand. So I was kind of a techie guy from the beginning. All right, so let's jump to Wikipedia and take a look at the history of money, because this is one of the things we often confuse: money versus currency versus an investment. They kind of have this overlapping function where there's play on both sides. So the history of money concerns the development of social systems that provide at least one of the functions of money. Such systems can be understood as a means of trading wealth indirectly. I want the cow, but I don't want to trade you 18 bales of hay for that cow or the calf or even the milk from the cow. That would have been directly as barter. Money was a mechanism that could facilitate this process without actually having to, at that moment, exchange those goods for the barter. So money can take the physical form as coins or notes, or may even exist as a written or an electronic account. And it may have intrinsic value as a commodity money, and therefore be legally exchangeable for something with intrinsic value. So I have got paper, and I want a Coca-Cola. So I'm going to exchange something of value, which would be the Coca-Cola, versus something that is without value, that being the paper. But we agree that it has value so that exchange can go forth. So we want it, we need it, and money makes the world go around, but then what is it? So I started my interest in money, in investing. That same Christmas back in 1976, my grandparents were Canadian, and so they would drive down, and I was in Idaho at the time. So my grandfather gave me a coin collecting kit that kick-started my interest in money, the types of money, and saving. And saving, from my grandfather's perspective, was about making smart investments, because I don't believe he was so much a saver of, say, currency, if you will. He liked bare land. He would find a city, or in this particular case, a city he was moving to, and look for land that a developer in time would come along and then offer him a rate above what he paid for it. And that was Grandpa's favorite kind of investing. And I think he did that because he was an architect by trade. And so that was part of his business. As an architect, you're going with the developer and you're looking for land. So that was how he enjoyed investing. And I know that he struggled with that because property can tend to be illiquid in times of economic distress, because what is used to buy property is typically debt. You've got to qualify for a loan, show a use, and then the bank will front you the money, knowing that, or hoping that, or trusting that you can pay that money back. And it'll come at a cost. And that cost is an interest rate. And we'll jump into that momentarily. So the power of compounding. This example shows how the earlier person begins to save for retirement, the more time that money has to grow. And I'm going to jump back right to Scott at 10 years old with a calculator. And I liked my calculator because I could figure out how much money I would earn just by savings. And in this particular example, investor one starts here at 25 years old, sets aside $5,000 per year, and that was about a car payment, a very expensive car payment for a 25-year-old for 10 years. And then after the conclusion of the 10 years, or the ninth year, no investments further were required. And to me, as a teenager, this had great appeal. That if you could earn 5, 6, 7, 8% and do it young, that you would have a fancy, nice little nest egg available for you as you reach retirement. And if I could start at 25, about the time you get out of college, set some money aside, and 8% interest, boom, we're golden. So with my calculator in hand, I began plotting my financial future with the power of compound interest and my youth. What was completely unknown to me, at least at this age, was my income, what my expenses would be, and any idea of what life's future events would hold. But hey, I was young. I was soon to learn that compound interest works both ways. So in college, certainly not able to save $5,000 a year. That was a lot of money. That was 4 terms of college expenses, including books in the middle 1980s. But at 21, a junior in college, I secured my first car loan. And with that, I ended up not earning compound interest, but paying compound interest. So I'm looking for ways to juice up the portfolio. So what I ended up doing was, with a with a GSL, a student loan, I had money I could float for a couple of months. I'm like, okay, I've got $400. What can I do with this? So what I discovered was, I could buy a little stock. So outside of the slow growth of coin collecting, meaning checking your change to see if there was anything that I got from the teller, from the cashier, that could go into my coin collections, I wanted to accelerate the growth of my meager investments. So I used a student loan money that I wouldn't need right away. So what I did was called up Kidder Peabody. They had an office down the street, and we did an exchange. I bought some Pan Am stock for 4 1/8 in February of, I believe, 1986. And by May, when I needed the money, I was fortunate enough to sold it for $6.50 a share. And that was that point in time where shares were done by fractions, not by the decimal place of 100th of a share, but by half, quarter, eighth, 16th, and so forth, or 32nd. It was divisible by fraction. So this was my first really beginnings into stock ownership. And so I was still dealing with the rule of 72, and we were in the 80s. 1985, 86, we went through an oil collapse where a barrel of oil, and this was much to my great excitement, went from $25 a barrel down to $4, $5, $6, $7 a barrel of oil. And I remember just being all excited, and I'll tell you why in a moment, why that was such a big deal for me. But the rule of 72, when we're investing and dealing with interest rates, number 72 divided by your interest rate equals the years to double your money. So at that point in time, 8% was what my parents paid in 1977 when they bought their house that we built when I was just a kid. So 9 years to double. Now think of this. They were paying interest, compounded monthly, compounded annually, or in the case of many credit cards right now, compounded daily. And we'll discuss how that pounds you into the ground because you're paying that interest. But what was happening was the interest rates kept dropping, at least temporarily. So compounding interest as a tool for investing just doesn't have the appeal that it used to when I was beginning, now that rates are 2%, or in some locations in Europe or are even negative. Japan is there as well. So who controls interest rates? Where to invest with bond-like security in this near zero-bound interest rate environment? Do these rates actually reflect the real risk that you are taking for loading your money at 2% interest, where it's going to take 36 years to double your money? All right, let's talk about money. Continental currency. This goes way back to the beginning of our nation, where this paper bill that had a serial number, in this particular case, it was 4432 of $20. This bill entitles the bearer to receive 20 Spanish milled dollars, or the value thereof, in gold or silver. You had a choice, gold or silver, according to the revolutions of the Congress held at Philadelphia on the 10th of May, 1775, and then a signature. So early U.S. notes were always backed by commodities, something that had inherent value, something like silver or gold, where 1 ounce of gold was set at $20 worth of paper notes. So now what is currency? Currency from Middle English, courant, or in circulation from Latin. The most specific sense is money in any form when in use or circulation is a medium of exchange, especially circulating banknotes and coins. A more general definition is that a currency is a system of money or monetary units in common use, especially for people in a specific nation. Under this definition, the U.S. dollars, euros, Japanese yen, or pound sterling are examples of currencies. These various currencies are recognized as stores of value. But are they? But they are traded between nations in foreign exchange markets, forex markets, which determine the relative values of the different currencies. Currencies in this sense are defined by governments, and each type has its limited boundaries of acceptance. And this becomes a big thing as we begin the 21st century. Other definitions of currency are discussed in their respective synonyms, such as banknotes, coin, and money. And now, as we've come into this century, digital currency has arisen with the popularity of computers and the internet. Whether digital currencies and notes will successfully be developed remains doubtful. Believe it or not, this Wikipedia footnote is nearly 20 years old. So this reference is as old as this century. So fiat money, and we kind of have to discuss fiat. Fiat is money that the government guarantees as legal tender. It's a government guarantee. Fiat money derives its value from government regulation or law. So fiat money has no intrinsic worth. What it is printed on is typically worthless, versus commodity money, which we talked about with that continental currency note, where that note, that particular piece of paper, had a guaranteed value that you could decide whether to take out of that currency note of gold or silver. So inflation, this becomes a very interesting thing, and how I got introduced to inflation. I remember as my dad, a school teacher and a coach, filling up the family car with gasoline in 1979. At the time, the states were enduring a second oil embargo crisis, and this ensured an inflationary stock, because when the cost of energy goes up, Therefore, everything that uses energy, which is almost everything in the current in our economy, also goes up. And I remember Dad being in distress because a $20 bill was used to fill the tank. But now with gas surging past 79 cents a gallon, that $20 bill did not fill up the family station wagon, nor did he have any change left over. So now that needle doesn't quite touch full, and there's nothing left to go back in the pocket once you leave the pump. So this was how I was introduced to inflation. So the word inflation originally applied solely to the quantity of money. It meant that the volume of money was inflated, was blown up or overextended. And then to suggest that inflation means a rise in prices, like we just described with gasoline, is to deflect attention away from the real cause and the real cure for inflation, meaning that there's just more dollars out there looking for a place to go, looking for an investment, usually into a hard asset. So more dollars mean each dollar is worth less. So if you have $1 million versus $1 billion, that $1 billion is going to go bid up the value of those necessities of life that we need to live. And an example, just the price of bread. As it climbs through, it's hard to go to the grocery store just even last week and find a nice loaf of bread that isn't approaching or have already crossed $5 per value, per loaf. So fiat money in 1963, and this was President Kennedy, the words "will pay to the bearer on demand" were removed from all newly issued Federal Reserve notes in silver payable to the bearer on demand. Remember, when silver left our pockets, when the last silver dime was struck, when the last silver dollar was struck, when the last silver quarter came out of the United States Mint, 1963 and 64. So I ask, how long would the nation's silver supply endure if all of us demanded an exchange of the fiat presently in our pockets be converted into a hard monetary asset, a hard asset like silver? Would the price of silver rocket, or would the game of musical chairs, where the last to redeem their fiat would simply be left empty-handed? Both would probably be true. So we have to go back in time just a little bit to the Nixon shock. And I didn't really realize that this is what it was called, but with the power of hindsight, this is what it is. Nixon shock was a series of economic measures taken by United States President Nixon in 1971 in response to increasing inflation. And I find it interesting that inflation in 71 was still sub 6%. And we've gone through so many adjustments in how the United States measures inflation. We have taken out the cost of energy. We have taken out the cost of healthcare. We have taken out the cost of housing to then determine a core rate of inflation. If we were to roll all of those costs back in, remember, energy was the one that got my dad back in the mid-70s. We've stripped that out. The cost of education, stripped out. And we're left with food and other somewhat basic necessities as a measure of inflation to goal seek how much let's say the tied in cost of, say, Social Security then has to give back to those participants. So if the rate of inflation is 2%, then the Social Security Administration only has to give a 2% raise to those beneficiaries, versus maybe 6% if all of our true costs were rolled into the cost of inflation. But back to the Nixon shock. So what they tried to do, and with the increasing inflation, was the most significant word, was to freeze the cost of goods, to then increase surcharges on imports and the unilateral cancellation of the direct international convertibility of the United States dollar to gold. Remember, in 1963, we canceled Americans' ability to exchange our dollars for silver, and it was less than a decade before we withdrew that right of other nations who had collected our currency to then exchange it for gold. And this formally abolished the Bretton Woods system. So the single Nixon shock allowed unlimited amounts of money to then be introduced into the system, this money that went chasing for assets. So if we go back and take a little bit of history, what Bretton Woods did was allow America, who had become the world's manufacturing base, But as that happened, we then ended up buying German and Japanese goods, allowing their economies to recover after the war. In France, the Bretton Woods system was called Americans' exorbitant privilege as a result of the asymmetric financial system where non-U.S. citizens see themselves supporting American standard of living and subsidizing American multinational companies. And as the American economist Barry Ehrlichgren summarized, it only costs a few cents for the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to produce a $100 bill, back to the foundations of fiat. But other countries had to pony up $100 of actual goods, mined goods, manufactured goods, goods where, whether it was wine, so grapes, milk, all these other kind of goods had to be gathered to then be sold and then exchanged for a $100 bill. In February 1965, President Charles de Gaulle announced his intention to exchange its U.S. dollar reserves for gold at the official rate. And that would have led to the United States losing its supply of gold, and eventually, instead of recommending a devaluation of the dollar, they simply closed the window whereby these foreign nations could then, hey, here's your dollars back. We want gold. You promised us this gold. We want that. And this was kind of an interesting subnote from Paul Krugman. Believe it or not, the man won a Nobel Prize in 2008. And in 20 years later, he called the Nixon era shock. The current world monetary system assigns no special role to gold. Indeed, the Federal Reserve is not obligated to tie the dollar to anything. It can print as much or as little as it deemed appropriate. And that is fascinating to take that point of view. So he's essentially saying the amount of dollars out there has no limits going up or going down. In this move, the country's dollar went from gold-backed to being backed by confidence. Simply confidence. All right, so numismatics. This is an interesting topic. It is the study or collection of currency, including coins, tokens, paper money, and related objects. While numismatics are often characterized as students or collectors of coins, the discipline is also introduced to the broader study of money and other payment media used to resolve debts in the exchange of goods. Early money used by people are referred to odd and curious, but the use of other goods in barter exchanges is excluded. So numismatics are bullion. And when I decided I needed, again, to juice the portfolio, I chose bullion because I always sensed that I got a little more from my notes. So instead of buying older numismatics, which would have been gold notes and certainly does have value, I tended to go for the bullion itself. What of value can the fiat currency be exchanged for? What or how can nations redeem large foreign currency account balances we just saw with France? And we have to revisit the Nixon shock, where the massive flow of funds into purchases of corporations and real estate like the Japanese were doing in the 1980s and the Chinese have been doing recently. So when you have literally a mountain of dollars and it's at risk of being devalued because, well, it's a mountain of dollars, you want to turn those dollars at an accepted exchange rate into something of hard value. You want to turn your fiat money back into something that will last. So fiat currency always has a cycle. It always meets the same end. The century, the government, the world conditions matter not. It doesn't matter. So we begin with something as our Continental Congress did with hard money. We had gold, we had silver, and you can understand or begin to understand why a gold rush was so important, because it allowed for the immediate inflation of the monetary supply, and those that mined the gold, mined the silver, then became rather wealthy. So hard money, currency backed by physical asset, or the medium exchange is trusted, and those transactions occur easily because you see the gold coin. You know there's value there, and you know you can use it at some point in the future. And that develops confidence. Commerce grows, the economy expands, and then demand for credit also increases. And as confidence matures, overconfidence is a result. Optimism abounds and trust in the system is high because it worked. It worked yesterday. It worked last year. It worked for my parents. So you have confidence in the system. Governments, citizens, and businesses all desire more credit. Why? So they can earn more money. They can earn more hard assets from their business activities. And as that grows, the demand for A division in the currency also grows. That appetite expands. Fiat money is eventually created, backed by the currency with the physical assets. In a way, becomes a hindrance. Government decrees that fiat money is now legal tender despite no physical or commodity backing that currency. And the economic participants believe in that money. And this may be close to where, well, we've certainly gone through this phase of gluttony. Governments create new money and credit at will. The system is flooded with liquidity, and every economic actor becomes over indebted. This has been going on for a while. One of the other aspects of this can be war. When you need to have an expansion in the currency to satisfy the demands of that war, whether it's a war on drugs, a war on poverty, a war on another nation. Every kind of war is a result or made possible because of the destruction of the sovereign nation's monetary policy. And then gluttony leads to abuse. Demand for cheap credit hits a wall as the government monetizes the debt, meaning it buys it back. We see the Federal Reserve doing this right now, to where the Treasury issues the debt to go out to stimulate the economy. The Federal Reserve buys the debt and sends those dollar bills right back into the Treasury to then send to the people or those that are eligible for such aid. And this is the next step, is lost confidence, because you realize that the inflation beast is out of the bag, that there are now trillions of dollars in the system, and they're not working the way that the government thought they might to stimulate the economy. So as the debt enters the system, economic growth declines due to excess debt burdens, meaning I don't have the income to pay it off. The federal government doesn't have the income, the tax revenue to pay it off. General Motors, IBM, many companies have bought stock using debt. And if the stock isn't also going up, then they don't have the money to make the interest payments on the debt. And that leads to an eventual failure. All confidence is lost, and hyperinflation renders the fiat money worthless. Paper back to paper. The economy collapses and a new currency backed by a trusted physical asset is introduced. And this is the exciting part, because you can see how the whole process has played itself out century after century after century, system after system. And this is eventually what it looks like. And we've had numerous examples of this in the last decade or two, where Zimbabwe, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe, where they have to print a note that is actually worth $100 trillion. Did you notice the denomination, $100 trillion? What could you buy with $100 trillion? And if these are all over the economy, then all of a sudden, a car, a gallon of milk, a home becomes worth many hundreds of trillions of dollars because it's so common. And so, looking back at my history, it must have been in or about early 2012 that Bitcoin continued to come across my attention as an alternative currency, an investment to the regular fiat currencies. And at that particular time, in this small town, people were talking dinar. There's going to be a reevaluation, and you want to buy the dinar. That still hasn't happened. Or you're stuck with stocks and bonds, and something new that solved the problems of the old, and in my eyes, something new that solved our previous problems, had astronomical potential. So a quick run back over the last 7 to 10 years. In 2010, it would take 10,000 Bitcoin, or a little less than a half a cent, or $41 to buy 2 pizzas. Fiat currency at that particular time was worth $10,000. We're just using this as a one-to-one example. And 7 years later, $10,000 of Bitcoin was worth about $9.6 million, per, and then about $96 million in total for 10,000 Bitcoin. Let's go back, because we're not done with that, Scott. And then the U.S. dealing with inflation in that 13 years had endured about 13% adjusted inflation. So money that you would have kept in currency would have devalued by 13%, whereas this other asset would have seen an astronomical appreciation. So something that solved fiat's problems while also decentralizing the creation of these units of exchange, in my eyes, was the holy grail of money. So what is cryptocurrency? 21st century unicorn, or the money of the future? Cryptocurrencies are the internet-based medium of exchange which uses cryptographic functions to conduct financial transactions. They leverage blockchain technology to gain decentralization, transparency, and immutability, meaning you can't go back and erase something off a ledger. You can't delete a transaction that has taken place. And this results, in my eyes, and in many others, of accountability. And this is what has been missing in the financial sector. The most important feature of cryptocurrency is that it is not controlled by central authority. The decentralized nature of the blockchain makes cryptocurrencies theoretically immune to old ways of government control and interference. They can be sent between two parties via the use of private and public keys, and these transfers can be done with minimal processing fees, allowing users to avoid steep fees charged by traditional financial institutions. So this solves many of the problems. And for the money changers, cryptocurrencies are their greatest fear of all realized, that the creation, supply, and use of money becomes unregulatable and therefore untraceable and untaxable. Without central banks, interest, income, and taxation ends the old world families. And most wars have been fought over this ancient privilege for the issuance of money. So we have privacy coins, Monero, Zcash, Verge. I think that's Bitcoin, Bitcoin Private, Komodo, Pivx, and some other, that's Navcoin. So there's some currencies out there which then add an aspect of privacy above all other coins. And there are numerous currencies out there. And the upside is they're generated by computers versus fiat being issued by governments, decentralized, meaning no one can control. Typically, there's some out there that are less accountable than others, so one would need to use, some good due diligence versus fiat currencies, which are simply centralized and monitored by government, a digital medium of exchange, a physical or electronic medium of exchange, because we have direct deposit, we have ATMs and so forth. Cryptocurrencies typically are limited in supply, although there are some which have codes which do allow them a rate of inflation. And then fiat currencies, of course, and we have learned completely unregulated in that way. So the big question is, and some of the other social issues, is when tech giants begin to dabble into cryptocurrencies to solve the global problem of currency exchanges, including cross-border payments, wild gyrations of sovereign exchange rates, and then also to facilitate in-app payments. A revolution in banking has begun. And it's my sense that this is Facebook's digital currency, that this will eventually be a big player in the time to come. All right, to review, money is not currency. Currency does not have to be government issued. Money equals control. Visible use of money equals control of because they can see what you're doing out there. The use of banking also equals control because you're in the system. And one of the fascinating things that the United States has done is to block out persons, to block out nations, to block out governments from using the fiat money system, the SWIFT system. So this is something that because of what the U.S. has done, other nations are responding. They're not necessarily adopting cryptos just yet, but they're working on other venues to where they can have exchanges that would supersede, work around, void sanctions. All financial systems blossom, mature, and then decay. And so we need to see, understand, then adopt the likely replacements before the herd arrives. And that will eventually result in pretty great returns. So that's kind of a beginning in currencies. There's some fascinating things going on in this world, and finance and cryptocurrencies, I think, are going to solve a lot of those financial system issues that lie immediately ahead if we are not already in the midst of. Good to see you guys kind of over there, Vicky, Donald, Charles, and so forth. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll kind of delve into cryptocurrencies a little bit more on Wednesday and just see how difficult it is or how simple it is to get into these alternative investments, these alternative uses, these mediums of exchange, because if I've done it, it's got to be stupid simple. All right, everybody, have a great afternoon. I'll see you at 5 o'clock for a look at the weather and this heat, just how long it's going to persist across the states. And we'll see you at 5 o'clock Mountain for that wrap up. Take care, everybody. Keep looking up.